The ink on the registry was barely dry when Joseph Easton pressed his thumb against the name and felt something cold move through his chest. Anna Calloway. He said it twice in his mind, tasting the shape of it, and knew with the quiet certainty of a man who had spent 12 years reading the truth behind every lie this territory had to offer that the woman standing across the room had never been called that name in her life. Not once. Not by anyone who loved her. She was arranging her traveling case with her back turned to him, and she was doing it the way a woman does when she is acutely aware that someone is watching her, each movement a little too deliberate, a little too composed. Her dark hair was pinned at the base of her neck, and there was a smudge of dust along her jaw from the coach ride, and she was the most carefully constructed piece of stillness he had ever seen in a room that smelled like pine soap and old ledger books. He set the registry down on the front desk of Mabel Hargrove's boarding house, and he did not look away from the name. The year was 1878, and the town of Cutter's Creek, Nevada, was not a place where people arrived without a reason. It sat 30 miles east of the rail line, at the junction of two cattle routes, and every soul who passed through it was either running from something, riding towards something, or both. Joseph had learned to tell the difference years ago. He had learned a great many things he wished he did not know. He picked up his hat from the counter where Mabel had left it, and he put it on his head, and he walked out the door without saying a word about the name. And the night air hit him like a wall of cedar and desert cold, and he stood on the porch of the boarding house for a long moment looking up at the stars above the Humboldt Range and thinking about secrets. He thought about all the ones that had gotten people killed in this county. And he thought about the woman inside with the wrong name on the registry and the face of someone who had been carrying a hidden weight for a very long time, and he told himself that whatever her dark past was, it was not his concern. He told himself that all the way back to the sheriff's office, and he did not believe it for a single step of the walk. 3 days before the moment, Joseph Easton pressed his thumb to that registry and felt his world quietly rearrange itself. Anna Blackwell had been sitting in a railway station in Sacramento with a carpetbag on her lap and a train ticket to Reno in her coat pocket, and a letter from a lawyer she had never met folded into a small square inside the lining of that coat, sewn there with her own hands at 2 in the morning, while the woman in the next room slept. The letter was addressed to a woman named Clara Whitfield. It contained instructions about a property deed. Anna had read it so many times she could recite it in the dark, and the most important line in it was this: the deed to the 40-acre parcel known as Blackwell Flats had been improperly seized by the Carver Land Company in 1876, and the original claimant or their lawful heir had until the 1st of September, 1878, to present a challenge before the Territorial Land Office in Carson City. That was 6 weeks away. Anna was the lawful heir. Anna was also the one person in the state of California that 3 men employed by the Carver Land Company had been looking for since April, because her father, Thomas Blackwell, had made the mistake of writing down what he knew about how the company operated before they got to him. And Anna had made the further mistake of letting one of their men see her face the night she retrieved those papers from her father's burned cabin. So she had bought the ticket to Reno under a false name, paid for it in cash, and when the train made its stop at a junction town called Cutter's Creek to take on water, she had looked out the window at the quiet dusty street and the red rock canyon walls and the small square building with the star painted on the door, and she had thought, with the sudden and irrational clarity of someone who is very tired of running, that this was where she needed to stop, not because it was safe, because it was small and far from the rail line, and she needed time to figure out how to reach Carson City without leading Carver's men straight to the land office with her. She got off the train with her carpetbag, and she did not get back on. Mabel Hargrove's boarding house was the first building she came to with a sign in the window. The registry was open on the front desk. The pen was sitting right there. And Anna Blackwell had written Anna Calloway in the cleanest, most confident handwriting she possessed, because confidence was the thing that made lies survivable, and she had signed it and paid her first week in advance, and told Mabel she was a seamstress traveling to visit a cousin in Carson City, which was close enough to a version of the truth that she could maintain it. What she had not expected was the sheriff. She had not expected him to be there at all. She had not expected a man in his early 30s with steady gray eyes and the kind of face that looked like it had been carved out of something that did not apologize for its own angles. And she had especially not expected the way those eyes had moved to the registry the moment he walked through the door, and the way his hand had gone still on the counter, and the way he had not said anything at all before he walked back out. That silence was the most frightening thing that had happened to her in weeks. She finished arranging her traveling case, and she sat down on the edge of the narrow bed in her room, and she pressed her hands flat against her thighs and told herself to think. If the sheriff had recognized the name as false, he would have said something. He would have asked questions. He would not simply have walked out into the dark. That was not how authority worked in her experience, and her experience of authority was not extensive, but it was instructive. Unless, she thought, he was the kind of man who waited, the kind of man who let a thing breathe for a while before he moved on it. That kind of man was considerably more dangerous. She slept very badly that night and dreamed about her father's handwriting in the margins of documents no living person was supposed to have read. Joseph Easton had been the sheriff of Cutter's Creek for 4 years, appointed first by the county seat and then re-elected by the town itself in the fall of 1876 by a margin that surprised no one who had watched him work. He was not a man who made speeches. He was not a man who wore his authority the way some men did, like a costume, like a performance. He wore it the way a person wears a scar, quietly and always. He had come to Nevada from Kansas. Before Kansas, there had been 2 years in the Army, and before the Army there had been a childhood in Missouri that he did not discuss, and before that there was nothing he was willing to examine. He was 31 years old. He owned a house on the eastern edge of town that was too large for one person and too quiet for any living thing except the dog that had followed him home from the livery stable 3 winters ago and decided to stay. He had named the dog nothing in particular. He called it Dog, and it seemed to find this acceptable. He was a man who read people the way other men read weather, by accumulation and pattern, and a particular quality of attention that most people experienced as unnerving without being able to say exactly why. Anna Calloway. He sat at his desk the morning after she arrived, and he wrote the name on a piece of paper and looked at it. He knew every family in the county by name. He had ridden through every homestead, every claim, every mining camp within 40 miles. There was no Calloway family in any direction. That was not unusual for a traveler, but most travelers who came through did not have that particular quality she had, that stillness that was not peace but the opposite of peace, the absolute controlled quiet of someone listening for footsteps. He wrote the name Anna underneath it and looked at that too. He thought about her hands on the traveling case. The calluses were not seamstress calluses. A seamstress develops them on the inside of the thumb and the first 2 fingers of the right hand, from needle pressure and thread tension. This woman's calluses were on the outer edges of her palms, the way a person gets them from carrying things, from gripping saddle leather or fence rails, from outdoor labor. She had worked land. He would wager on it. He folded the paper and put it in his desk drawer and went about his morning. The morning involved a dispute between 2 ranchers about a shared water source, a delivery of supplies at the general store that needed supervising, because the last 2 deliveries had come up short, and a conversation with his deputy, a cheerful 26-year-old named Rand Mallory who talked too much and noticed too little, about the schedule for the coming week. He did not go back to the boarding house. He let the morning pass and the afternoon half go, and then at around 4 o'clock he went to the general store because he needed coffee and flour, and because Mabel Hargrove kept an account there and he could, without appearing to, ask after the new boarder. He did not have to ask. She was there. Anna Blackwell was standing at the dry goods counter with a list in her hand, speaking to old Clement Pierce about thread and fabric, and she was doing it with the kind of focused practicality of a woman who is maintaining a cover story with every breath. She was buying seamstress supplies. He almost admired the thoroughness of it. She saw him the instant he walked through the door, because people who are hiding always see the person they are afraid of the instant they enter a room, and her eyes went to his badge first and then to his face, and she went completely still for the duration of exactly one heartbeat before she arranged her expression into something pleasant and neutral. He tipped his hat. She nodded. He collected his coffee and his flour and he paid and he left, and he did not look back, and he spent the rest of the afternoon thinking about what a woman with land worker's hands and a false name and eyes that went to his badge like it was a loaded weapon might be running from, and whether it was the kind of thing that was going to come looking for her in his town. On the fourth day after her arrival, Anna made a mistake. It was a small mistake, and she knew it the moment it happened, which was in some ways worse than not knowing. She was eating dinner in the boarding house parlor with 3 other guests, a mining surveyor named Holt, and a married couple called the Prestons who were relocating to Oregon, and the conversation had turned to land, the way it always did in 1878 Nevada, because land was the currency of survival and everyone was thinking about it. The surveyor said something about the Carver Land Company, specifically about how they had opened an office in Elko and were buying up range rights faster than anyone could track, and something in Anna's face changed. She knew it changed because she felt it, the involuntary tightening around her eyes, the compression of her mouth, the flash of something that was not fear exactly, but was related to fear the way lightning is related to a storm. Holt the surveyor did not notice. Mrs. Preston was looking at her soup. Mr. Preston was looking at the window. Joseph Easton, who had been invited to take his supper at the boarding house that evening at Mabel's insistence because she worried about him eating alone at the office, was sitting 3 chairs down the table, and he noticed. She saw him notice. For a moment they were simply looking at each other across the table, and the thing that happened in that moment was something Anna had not been prepared for, which was that his eyes were not cold. They were careful. There was a difference that she had not expected to find in a lawman's face, and the difference undid something small and structural inside her chest. She looked back at her food. After dinner she went upstairs and he stayed in the parlor to speak with Mabel, and she was at the top of the stairs when she heard Mabel say, "The new boarder seems a quiet thing, doesn't she?" And she stopped breathing to hear his response. There was a pause, and then Joseph Easton said, "She seems like a woman with a great deal on her mind." Anna walked the rest of the way down the hall and closed her door and stood against it in the dark for a long time. The next morning he was waiting on the porch of the boarding house with 2 cups of coffee and the dog. She stopped in the doorway and looked at him and at the coffee and at the dog, which was a large, mismatched sort of animal that appeared to have been assembled from the spare parts of several different breeds, and she said, "I did not expect company." "No," he said, "I don't imagine you did." He held out one of the cups. She took it, because refusing it would have been more revealing than accepting it, and she sat down on the far end of the porch steps with the coffee in both hands and waited. "Cutter's Creek is a quiet town," he said after a moment. "We have about 430 souls, give or take, and I know most of them personally and the rest by reputation. We have a good mercantile, a decent doctor, a preacher who drinks a little more than he probably ought to but gives solid counsel. We get the occasional trouble from the Ramsay brothers when they come in from their claim and feel like celebrating, but nothing that takes more than a conversation to manage." She said nothing, and he continued, "What we don't get much of is people passing through who aren't going anywhere in particular. We're off the main routes. People come here because they mean to or because something specific happened that brought them. Not too many people stumble into Cutter's Creek by accident." She took a sip of the coffee. It was very good. "Perhaps I liked the look of it from the train window," she said. "Perhaps," he said, with the patience of a man who is not in any hurry. The dog had put its large head on her knee without asking permission, and she looked down at it and then at Joseph, and she said, "Does your dog do that to everyone?" "No," he said, "actually not. He's usually considerably more reserved." There was a small pause in which neither of them acknowledged that this meant anything, and then he stood up and collected his cup and said, "I hope you find everything you need in town, Miss Calloway. If you need anything at all, my office is right across the square." He walked away, and she sat on the porch with the dog's head on her knee and the word Calloway echoing in her chest with a slight but unmistakable irony, and she thought, "This man knows. He knows, and he hasn't done anything about it yet," and she could not decide whether that was mercy or strategy. What she did not know, because she could not have known it, was that it was both. Joseph had pulled the Kansas warrants directory from the filing cabinet in his office that morning and looked through it for any woman matching her general description, and had found nothing. He had written to the county seat at Elko for any circulars that might have come through in the last 3 months, and he was waiting on a reply. He had also quietly described her to the station master at the water stop, who confirmed that she had gotten off the eastbound train, not the westbound, which meant she had come from California, not from the interior. None of this told him what he most wanted to know, which was whether she was in danger. He was becoming, in a way he found professionally inconvenient and personally difficult to examine directly, more interested in that question than in any question of who she was or what name she was traveling under. On the 6th day after her arrival, the Carver Land Company's men arrived in Cutter's Creek. There were 2 of them, and they came in on horseback from the south, not from the rail junction, which meant they had ridden out specifically, not arrived by chance. They tied their horses in front of the saloon, and they went inside and they stayed for 2 hours, and then they came out and walked down the main street with the slow, deliberate movement of men who are looking at every face they pass. Joseph was in the street outside the livery when they came out of the saloon, and he watched them do their looking, and he noted with the particular focus of a man who has spent 4 years cataloging human behavior in a small town that they stopped in front of the general store and looked at the handwritten list posted in the window of the boarding house across the square. He walked over. "Afternoon," he said, with the tone that said sheriff as clearly as the badge. The taller of the 2 men turned around and produced a smile that did not reach his eyes and said they were passing through, looking for a woman, a relative who had left Sacramento without telling the family where she was going. Joseph said that sounded like a concern, and was there something he could do to help? The man described a woman who was, in every particular except the name, Anna Blackwell. Dark hair, medium height, traveling alone, had a carpetbag, was possibly using a different name. Joseph listened to this with his full attention, and then he said, "I haven't seen anyone matching that description, but if I do, I'll be sure to let her know her family is looking for her." The man's smile thinned. He said that would be very helpful. Joseph said he was happy to be of service, and he stood there in the middle of the street while they walked back to the saloon, and he did not move until he was certain they had gone inside, and then he walked at a pace that looked unhurried but covered ground efficiently to the back entrance of the boarding house. Mabel met him in the kitchen, and he asked her where the new boarder was without any preamble, and Mabel, who was a sensible woman and who had known Joseph Easton for 4 years and trusted the tone she was hearing, told him that Miss Calloway had gone to the north end of town to look at the canyon overlook, as she did most afternoons. He was back outside in 2 steps. He found her at the edge of the overlook, which was a flat shelf of red rock above the town where you could see in 3 directions for miles, and she was sitting on the rock with her knees pulled up and her face turned toward the west, where the late afternoon light was turning the desert gold. And she turned when she heard his boots on the stone, and the look on her face when she saw who it was mixed together relief and suspicion in proportions he had never seen in a human face before. He sat down next to her on the rock, closer than propriety in 1878 Nevada strictly required, because there was no time for propriety. "There are two men in the saloon," he said. "They described you very accurately. They said you're a missing relative. I told them I hadn't seen anyone matching that description." She was very still. "I need you to tell me," he said, "right now, whether these are men I need to be concerned about for reasons beyond the matter of your name on the registry." She turned and looked at him, and in the direct light of the afternoon, he could see that her eyes were a very dark green, almost brown in some lights, and that there was a decision happening behind them that he could almost watch in real time, the weighing and measuring of how much to give and what to hold back. She said, "They work for a company that has been trying to find me since April. They are not my relatives. They killed my father." The last four words came out flat, and Even and Joseph felt them land like stones dropped in still water. "The Carver Land Company," he said. Her expression shifted in a way that was almost imperceptible, but he caught it. "You know about them," he said. "I know they've been buying up land claims across this part of Nevada by methods that are not always legal," he said. "I've had 2 complaints from small ranchers in the last year that I haven't been able to do much about because the company has lawyers and the ranchers don't, and the county seat is not particularly interested in crossing a company that employs 50 men and has a lawyer in Elko." She looked away. The wind moved her hair. She said, "My father's name was Thomas Blackwell. He had a 40-acre parcel north of Winnemucca. He found out how they were doing the seizures, what documents they were forging, who they were bribing. He wrote it all down. They burned his cabin in March. He was inside." Joseph sat with this for a moment. "And the papers," he said. "I got to them first," she said. "He had a second hiding place. They did not know about it. And you've been running since March." "Yes. Your real name is not Calloway." She looked at him for a long moment, and then she said, "No." He said, "What is it?" And she said very quietly, "Anna Blackwell." He repeated it once in his own mind the way he had repeated Anna Calloway on the first night. It fit her considerably better. "The deed," he said, "is it in your father's name?" "Yes. He filed the original claim in 1871. The land office in Carson City has the record. The Carver Company seized it with a fraudulent transfer in 1876, and my father contested it through a lawyer until the lawyer was paid off and stopped representing him. I have the papers that show the fraudulent transfer, and I have a letter from a different lawyer in Sacramento who says I can file a challenge through the territorial office if I do it before September 1st. That's 6 weeks. 5 weeks and 4 days, she said. He stood up and looked out over the town below them, at the 2 horses tied in front of the saloon, and he thought about what he could do and what he was willing to do, and whether those were the same list. "Those men are going to stay in the saloon until evening," he said, "and then they're going to ask questions. When they ask the right questions, they're going to find out about you. I can make that process slower, but I cannot stop it indefinitely." She stood up too, and she was close to him on the narrow ledge of rock, and he could see the tension in her jaw, the set of her shoulders, and the thing that was holding all of it together, which was a stubbornness that he recognized because he possessed the same variety of it. "I'm not going to run again," she said, and there was a quality in her voice that made it clear this was not a statement of preference but of decision, something that had been resolved before she spoke it. He looked at her for a long moment, and something inside him that had been oriented vaguely toward caution rearranged itself without consulting the rest of him. "No," he said, "you're not. You're going to stay here, and I'm going to deal with those men, and you're going to tell me everything about those documents." She said, "Why would you do that?" He considered giving her a professional answer about the duties of a peace officer in the territory of Nevada. He did not give that answer. He said, "Because your father deserved better than what happened to him, and so do you." She did not say anything to that, but she did not look away either. They came down from the overlook separately, 5 minutes apart, and Joseph went directly to the saloon. The 2 men were at the bar. Their names, as he learned from the saloon keeper before he reached them, were Del Farrow and a man they called Swick. Farrow was the one who had done the talking in the street. He had the compact, watchful manner of someone who had been hired specifically for this kind of work, tracking people down, and Swick was quieter and larger, and had the demeanor of a man who was there to enforce whatever Pharaoh arranged. Joseph sat down one stool away from Pharaoh at the bar and ordered a coffee, which the saloon keeper provided without comment because the sheriff's preference for coffee in saloons was a known fact in Cutter's Creek. He said, conversationally, that he had been asking around and thought he might have gotten a lead on their missing relative. He said a woman matching their description had been seen at the rail junction 2 days ago, heading east toward Elko. Pharaoh watched him with the eyes of a man sorting through options and said that was useful information. Joseph said he hoped it would be. He said travel in that direction could be rough going and he wouldn't want them to have any trouble. He suggested they get a good night's rest and head out in the morning. Pharaoh smiled the smile that did not reach his eyes and said they might do that. Joseph finished his coffee and left, and he went to the boarding house and knocked on the door of Anna's room and told her quietly through the door to bolt it and stay inside for the evening, and she said, "What did you tell them?" And he said, "East, toward Elko. We have until morning, possibly slightly longer." There was a pause, then she said, "Thank you." He stood in the hallway for a moment longer than he needed to, and then he went downstairs and sat in the parlor and drank 2 more cups of coffee and wrote a letter to the county sheriff in Elko and another to a territorial marshal he had met once at a conference in Reno and respected. And he described the Carver Land Company and what he knew about their methods. And he asked very specifically about any outstanding matters of fraud or land seizure that might be under territorial jurisdiction. He sent both letters on the first stage of the morning, before dawn. At dawn he was also in the street when Pharaoh and Swick came out of the hotel, which was a different establishment from the boarding house, and he watched them ride east without a backward glance, and he thought, they are professionals and professionals know when to regroup, and this is not finished. But it was a beginning. He went to find Anna Blackwell. She was already awake. She was in the small back garden of the boarding house, sitting at the iron table with a cup of tea and the documents spread before her, weighted against the morning breeze with smooth stones she had found somewhere. And she looked up when he came through the garden gate, and there was something new in her face. Not trust exactly, not yet, but the precursor of trust, the thing that happens when someone has acted well toward you twice in a row, and you cannot quite stop accounting for it. He sat down across from her, and she turned the documents so he could read them, and he read them with the careful thoroughness of a man who takes things seriously, without rushing, without performing attention, and she watched him read with the particular quality of attention that a person gives to something they cannot control. The documents were exactly what she had described. The original claim record, a copy of the fraudulent transfer document which had a notary seal from a notary in Elko, who Joseph happened to know had a reputation for selling his seal to whoever paid, the correspondence between Thomas Blackwell and the company's lawyers, and her father's handwritten account of a conversation he had overheard between the company's regional manager and a county official about adjusting the land survey records. The handwritten account was the most significant piece. It named names, it described specific methods. It was the kind of document that, in the hands of the right people, could expose not just a land seizure but a systematic pattern of fraud across multiple counties. Joseph set it down and looked at her and said, "Your father was a brave man." She put her hand flat on the paper and did not speak for a moment. Then she said, "He trusted that the law would protect him. He believed in it." The implication was not lost on Joseph, and he did not pretend it was. "The law failed him," he said. "That is not the same thing as the law being wrong. It means the people representing it were." She looked at him steadily. "Are you going to represent it better?" "I'm going to try," he said. It was not a grand promise. It was not decorated with certainty. It was the straightforward answer of a man who takes his commitments at their exact weight, and she appeared to recognize it as such, because something in the set of her shoulders changed slightly. "Tell me exactly what you need to do," he said, And I will tell you what I can do to make it possible." So she told him. The timeline was this. The challenge had to be filed in Carson City at the Territorial Land Office no later than the 1st of September. Today was the 14th of July. The route to Carson City from Cutter's Creek was approximately 220 miles. It could be done in 8 or 9 days by horse, more if the roads were bad. The challenge required her physical presence and the original documents, and the lawyer in Sacramento had arranged for a second lawyer in Carson City, named Everett James, to meet her there and manage the filing. The problem was that the road between Cutter's Creek and Carson City passed through territory where the Carver Company had connections, specifically through a town called Hardin Crossing, where their regional office was, and through 2 stretches of open country where 2 people traveling alone could be stopped without witnesses. Joseph listened to all of this and then he said, "We can go around Hardin Crossing. It adds 2 days, and we won't be alone." She looked at him. "You would come with me." "I have jurisdiction," he said, "for matters of fraud and property theft that occurred within or that have material connection to this county. It's a stretch, but it'll hold if anyone asks, and I can deputize Rand Mallory to cover the town while I'm gone." "You would leave your town," she said, and there was in her voice the quality of someone who is not quite believing the thing they are hearing. "My town will still be here when I get back," he said. "It's a quiet town mostly. The Ramsay brothers are over in Winnemucca through August." She looked at him for a long time, and he looked back, and neither of them looked away, and in the morning light in Mabel Hargrove's back garden with the documents on the table between them, something that was not yet love but was unmistakably its raw material began to move between them like current through wire. She said, "I don't have enough money to pay you." He said, "I'm not asking to be paid." She said, "Then why?" He said, "Because it's right." And then he picked up his hat from the table and stood up, and he said, "We should leave day after tomorrow. That gives me time to arrange things here and gives you time to prepare. Keep the documents close. And if you see either of those men again, come to me first before you do anything else." She said she would, and he went back through the gate, and the dog that had been sitting patiently on the other side of the garden wall the entire time fell into step beside him. And Anna Blackwell sat alone at the iron table in the morning sun and put her hand over the documents, and for the first time since March she felt something that was not purely fear. She was not sure yet what to call it. She thought she would let it stay unnamed for now, the way some things have to be allowed to develop in the dark before they can bear examination. The next day and a half moved in the way time does before a journey, simultaneously too fast and too slow. Joseph spent it making arrangements. He spoke to Rand Mallory at length and gave him written instructions and a short list of people to contact in various contingencies. He spoke to the Territorial Marshal's office in Reno by telegraph, leaving a message about the Carver Land Company documents and the pending challenge, so that at least one official body outside of Elko's sphere of influence knew what was in play. He packed his saddlebags with what a man needs for 10 days on the road, and he arranged for a second horse to be ready for Anna at the livery. Anna spent the day and a half in her room, copying the most critical sections of the documents in her best handwriting onto a second set of paper that she sewed into the lining of her traveling coat, because if the originals were lost, there had to be something left. She was thorough and methodical, and she worked by candlelight until well past midnight. In the morning, at 5:30, before the rest of the town was fully awake, they rode out of Cutter's Creek heading northwest, toward the longer route that would keep them clear of Hardin Crossing. They rode in silence for the first hour, because the morning was still and cool, and the desert was the color of iron and rose, and there was something in it that did not require commentary, and because both of them were the kind of people who understood that unnecessary words are a kind of noise, and that silence between 2 people who are paying attention to each other is not absence, but its own form of conversation. He had brought coffee in a sealed tin and biscuits wrapped in cloth from the boarding house kitchen, and they stopped at a creek crossing to water the horses and drink the coffee, and she said, "You didn't tell Mabel what was happening." "No," he said. "Why?" "Because the fewer people who know the route, the better, and because Mabel would have told the Prestons and they would have told each other at the breakfast table, and by noon it would have been general knowledge." She looked at him over the rim of the tin cup. "You understand gossip very well for a man." "I understand people," he said, "which includes gossip." She turned away to look at the creek and said, "How long have you been sheriff here?" 4 years. "And before that?" He was quiet for a moment in the way that meant he was deciding what to share, not what to hide. "Kansas," he said. "I was a deputy in Abilene for 2 years. Before that I was in the Army." "Where in the Army?" "Mostly Kansas and the territories." "It was not," he said, with the careful phrasing of a man who has thought about something a great deal, "a time I am entirely proud of. There were things done in those years that I have spent a fair amount of time since then trying to balance out." She looked at him and said, "The campaigns against the Cheyenne." He met her eyes. "Yes." She held his gaze for a long moment and said, "I appreciate that you said it directly." "I've found that not saying things directly is a form of dishonesty I can't afford," he said. She nodded slowly and handed him back the empty cup, and they mounted up and rode on, and the morning opened up around them like something that was trying to be generous. On the second day of the journey, the landscape shifted from open basin to foothills, and the riding was slower, and the shadows of the canyon walls were a relief in the afternoon heat. They made camp near a spring that Joseph knew from a previous ride through the area, a small flat clearing with a natural windbreak of rock on the north side, and enough dry fuel for a good fire. He made the fire, and she prepared what she had from the provisions, and they ate with the efficiency of 2 people who have been on the road long enough to be past self-consciousness about the practical necessities. She had been riding well, he noticed. Better than a seamstress would, better than a woman who had spent the last several months in city rooms. She rode with the ease of someone who had grown up with horses. He said, "How long did your family have the Blackwell Flats parcel?" She set down her spoon and said, "My father filed the claim in 1871 when I was 13. We came out from Ohio. He had been a schoolteacher there, but after my mother died he thought a fresh start somewhere with land of our own. He built the cabin himself. He was not a man built for that kind of work. He was a scholar at heart, but he was stubborn." She paused. "He used to say that stubbornness is just love that doesn't know when to stop." Joseph said nothing, but he was looking at her with the particular attention he gave to things that mattered. She continued, "When the company came the first time, in 1875, he tried to negotiate. When they came the second time with the fraudulent transfer paper, he got a lawyer. When the lawyer stopped returning his letters, he started writing things down. Everything he knew, every conversation, every document he managed to see. He was very systematic about it." She looked at the fire. "He was still writing when they came for the third time. The silence after that was the kind that is full, not empty. After a while Joseph said, 'How old are you?' She said, 'I'll be 27 in November.' He said, 'I'm 31. He was not entirely sure why he told her that, except that it felt relevant in a way he was not ready to examine. She looked at him across the fire with an expression that was somewhere between curiosity and something warmer and said, "Is there a Mrs. Easton?" "No," he said. "Was there?" He said, "No. I was engaged once in Kansas. It did not work out. She was a sensible woman and she made the right decision." She said, "That's a generous interpretation." He said, "I think she was right to make it. I wasn't home enough. I wasn't present enough for the kind of life she wanted." He poked at the fire. "I'm better at being responsible for a town than I was at being responsible for one person." She said quietly, "I don't think those things are necessarily different." He looked at her then directly, and she was looking at the fire, and the line of her profile in the firelight was something that he wanted to look at for considerably longer than was advisable, and he made himself look at the fire instead. She said, "There was someone for me too. In Sacramento, he was kind, he was reliable, he was everything that a woman in my situation should have wanted." But Joseph said, "But I wanted the land, my father's land. I could not stop wanting it, even when the wanting was going to cost everything, and he could not understand why I wasn't willing to leave it behind and start somewhere else." Joseph said, "Some things can't be left behind." She looked at him then, and he was still looking at the fire, and she said, "No, I'm learning that." The third day brought weather, the sudden violent afternoon thunderstorms that the Great Basin produced in July without much warning, and they found shelter in a narrow canyon overhang and waited out the worst of it with the horses standing close and the lightning walking across the ridgeline in long, bright steps. They were pressed closer together than they had been at any point in the journey, because the overhang was not large, and she was leaning against the rock wall with her arms crossed against the cold that the rain had brought, and he had taken off his coat and held it out to her without saying anything. And after a moment she took it and put it around her shoulders, and he stood at the edge of the overhang watching the storm, and she watched him, the width of his shoulders against the light, the way he stood without restlessness, as though stillness were a thing he had made friends with a long time ago. She said, "Joseph." He turned. She said, "Thank you, not just for this, for all of it. For not arresting me when you knew that first night." He said, "I didn't know that first night, I suspected." She said, "You knew." He held her gaze for a moment, and then he almost smiled, which was a thing she had not seen him do and which altered the architecture of his face in a way she found she wanted to study more closely. He said, "I knew." She said, "Why didn't you say anything?" He said, "Because a person's name is not always the most important thing about them." She stood there with his coat around her shoulders in the rain-cold canyon, and she thought that this was possibly the kindest thing anyone had said to her since March, and she felt something move in her chest that was not ambiguous at all, that was entirely clear and entirely terrifying and entirely welcome, all three at once. She did not say anything about it, but she held the coat a little closer. The storm passed and they rode on, and on the fourth day they came down out of the foothills toward the Carson River Valley, and the terrain opened up, and the sky was enormous and pale, and the road was better here, more traveled, and they made good time. On the fifth day they passed through a small settlement called Piper's Rest, where they stopped to rest the horses and take a meal at the only establishment serving food, a low building run by a Basque woman named Iriate, who made a lamb stew that was extraordinary, and who spoke to them in a mixture of Spanish and heavily accented English, and who looked at them both in turn with the unambiguous assessment of a woman who sees what is happening between two people and finds it worth commenting on. She said something in Spanish and looked at Joseph. He said he did not speak Spanish. She repeated it in English. She said, "She looks at you like she is deciding whether to trust you." He said, "That's accurate," Iriate said, "and you look at her like you already have." She put the stew on the table and went back to the kitchen. Anna was looking at the stew. Joseph was looking at the table. After a moment he said, "She is not wrong." Anna picked up her spoon and said, "No, she is not," and neither of them said anything else about it. But the air between them had changed in a way that the stew and the low ceiling and the afternoon light through the small window all conspired to make feel very real. That night they camped in a meadow near the river, the first genuinely beautiful camp of the journey, with cottonwood trees and the sound of water and the sky doing its extravagant evening production in the west. And Anna sat at the river's edge and washed the dust off her face and hands and looked at the water moving over the pale stones and thought about her father. She thought about him standing at the edge of his land on a morning in spring, looking at the mountains to the north, and the satisfaction that had been in his face in those early years, the specific satisfaction of a man who has made something real out of a life that had been knocked sideways by grief. She thought about his handwriting in the margins of the documents, precise and small, and the care he had taken with every word, the schoolteacher's habit of being exact. She thought about the fact that what she was doing, right now, riding toward Carson City with the papers in her coat and a sheriff from Nevada at her side, was the continuation of what he had started. It was the stubbornness that was love that didn't know when to stop. She heard Joseph's footsteps on the bank behind her, and she said, without turning, "I keep wondering if I am doing this because I want the land or because I need to finish what he started." He sat down on the bank beside her at a distance that had been getting slowly, almost imperceptibly smaller as the journey continued. He said, "Can it be both?" She said, "I don't know. I worry that I've been so focused on the goal that I haven't stopped to ask whether I actually want to live on that land after everything, whether it would feel like home or like a grave." He said, "What did it feel like before?" She thought about this. "Like the truest version of myself," she said. "I know that sounds like too much. But there was something about that land, the way it sat against the mountains, the quality of the light in the mornings that made me feel like I was exactly where I was supposed to be." He said, "Then it's home, and homes are worth fighting for." She turned to look at him close enough now that she could see the gray of his eyes was not a flat color but had depth to it, shifting layers like good river stone. She said, "Do you have that, a place that feels like that?" He considered this seriously. He said, "I think I had it in Kansas for a while, but it went away. I'm not sure I've found it again yet." She said, "Maybe it's not a place." He looked at her. She said, "Maybe it's a thing you carry." And then she looked away, back at the river, because she had said more than she meant to, and she was not ready yet for what he might say back. He said nothing, but he stayed where he was on the bank beside her until the last of the light was gone. On the seventh day of the journey, two things happened. The first was that Pharaoh and Swick found them. They came out of a stretch of pinyon pine on the road, two horses blocking the way, and Pharaoh had a rifle across his saddle that was not pointed anywhere specific, which is its own kind of threat, the ambiguity of it. Joseph had seen them in enough time to move his horse to the left of Anna's and slightly ahead, which put him between them, and his hand was resting on his thigh 2 inches from his revolver, and his face was entirely composed. Pharaoh said that this was quite a coincidence. Joseph said, "I've been a lawman long enough that I've stopped believing in coincidence." Pharaoh said the woman was wanted for theft of documents that were the property of the Carver Land Company. Joseph said, "Theft of documents is a matter for the courts. You're not the courts. You're two men blocking a public road in Nevada, which is a crime regardless of who you work for." Pharaoh said the company's lawyers would have something to say about that. Joseph said, "I'm sure they will. In the meantime, you can tell them that you encountered a territorial peace officer transporting a material witness in a matter of land fraud being investigated by the territorial marshal's office in Reno, and that you chose to obstruct that officer in the performance of his duties. You can also tell them that if anything happens to this woman or to these documents, I have already sent copies of my report to 2 separate offices and named the Carver Land Company specifically." He paused. "I have made it professionally inconvenient to harm us." This was, as far as it went, accurate. The report was real. The copies were real. Whether they would be sufficient protection was a different question, and Joseph was very aware of the loaded rifle across Pharaoh's saddle. Swick and Pharaoh looked at each other. Joseph said, very quietly so that Anna could hear him, but they could not quite make out the words, "Don't move. Don't speak. Trust me." She said nothing. She was absolutely still. The silence stretched for a count of 10, and then Pharaoh said they would be in touch with their lawyers, and he pulled his horse off the road to the right and Swick followed, and Joseph and Anna rode through without looking back, maintaining a careful, unhurried pace until they were around the next bend and out of sight. Then Joseph said, very quietly, "Keep riding." She did. He said, "We're going to pick up the pace for the next few miles, and then we're going to stop and make sure they're not following." She said, "Are you sure they'll let us go?" He said, "No, but I think I made it expensive enough for now." They rode hard for 20 minutes and then stopped in the shelter of an outcropping where they could see the road behind them for a quarter mile, and there was no movement. Joseph dismounted and stood with his hand on his horse's neck and let the tension in his body slowly release, and Anna dismounted beside him, and she was breathing a little fast, and she said, "You were frightening back there." He said, "Good. That was the intention." She said, I mean to them, not to me." She paused. It was not the same thing at all. He turned to look at her, and she was looking at him with her heart completely visible in her face, just for a moment before she composed herself, and he thought, "This is the bravest person I have met in a very long time," and the thought came with a warmth he did not try to contain. He said, "Are you all right?" She said, "Yes." And then she said, "No." And then she said, "I will be." He reached out and touched her arm just briefly, the lightest contact, and she looked down at his hand and then back up at his face, and the moment lasted exactly long enough to change the shape of everything that came after it. He said, "2 more days." She nodded. They rode on. The second thing that happened on the 7th day was that Anna told him about the hiding place in Ohio. The summer she was 11, before her mother died, when her father used to take her to a bend in the Scioto River and teach her the names of things, every plant and stone and passing bird, with the patience of a man who believed that precision was a form of love. She told him this not because it was relevant to anything they were doing, but because they had been riding side by side for 7 days, and the conversation had passed through the first layers of necessary information and into the territory of the things that make a person who they are. And he told her about Missouri, about the summer he was 14 and his father brought him out to see what the land looked like before the farms came, the original prairie grass that still existed in 1 or 2 places, the quality of it, the way it moved in the wind, and how he had understood for the first time that the country had a life before any of them arrived in it, and that this was worth knowing. They talked for 3 hours riding through the pine country, and by the end of it each of them knew the other in the particular way that comes from the exchange of old and private things, and the road was easier in the afternoon, and the sky above the trees was the deep, unambiguous blue of high summer in the west. On the 9th day, they rode into Carson City. It was a real city by the standards of Nevada in 1878, the territorial capital, with a proper main street and a telegraph office, and a land office with territorial seals on the door, and a courthouse that looked like it had ambitions. Anna had a letter for the lawyer Everett James, and his office was on the 2nd block, and she went there directly while Joseph saw to the horses and arranged rooms at the hotel. Everett James was a compact, serious man in his 40s with the manner of someone who has spent 20 years not being surprised by anything, and he looked at Anna's documents with the same careful attention Joseph had given them 2 weeks ago, and then he looked at her and he said, "This is good. This is very good, Miss Blackwell. This is the kind of evidence we can work with." She felt her knees go uncertain and she gripped the edge of his desk. He said, "The filing will need to be done tomorrow morning. I've already prepared the challenge document. We'll need you to sign several affidavits, and then we present to the clerk and the record is made. After that, the matter goes to the territorial board, which meets in August, and I believe strongly that with this evidence we have an excellent case." She said, "How long before a decision?" He said, "Possibly 60 days, possibly longer, but the challenge stops the clock. No further seizure or transfer can occur while the matter is before the board." She said, "And the people who killed my father?" He looked at her carefully and said, "That is a matter for criminal prosecution, which is separate from the property challenge. But the documents your father wrote, if they are as thorough as they appear, support criminal charges of fraud and potentially accessory to arson. I would recommend forwarding copies to the territorial prosecutor's office." Joseph was in the doorway. She had not heard him come in. He said, "I'll handle that." Everett James looked at him and at the badge and said, "Good." That evening, they ate dinner in the hotel dining room, a real dining room with white tablecloths and candles, and it felt slightly absurd after 9 days of camp food and creek crossings. And Anna was wearing the better of the 2 dresses she had brought in her carpetbag, and her hair was properly arranged, and Joseph had put on the clean shirt he had been saving for civilization. And they sat across from each other in the candlelight like 2 people who have just come through something together and do not yet know how to be still, She said, "I feel like I should say something formal, like making a speech." He said, "Please don't." She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed in his presence genuinely, without restraint, and it was low and real, and it transformed her face in a way that hit him somewhere behind the sternum with considerable force. She said, "What happens after tomorrow?" He said, "What do you want to happen?" She was quiet for a moment, and then she said, "I want to go home, to the land. I know it's in the possession of the company right now, and I know the board has to decide, but I want to go back to Winnemucca, to the parcel, and I want to stand on it even if there's nothing there. I want to stand on my father's land." He said, "Then we will go." She looked at him. "We." He said, "I told you I would see this through." She said, "You've done that. You came to Carson City. You have the documents. The filing is tomorrow. Your obligation is satisfied." He said, "It's not about obligation." The candle between them moved in some draft from the kitchen door, and she watched him in the wavering light and said, "Joseph, what is it about?" He said, "You know what it's about." She said, "I need you to say it." He looked at her for a long moment, and then he said, with the directness that was native to him, the thing she had learned was how he was built. "It's about the fact that I have been riding through the Nevada desert for 9 days with a woman I respect more than any person I have met in 4 years of being sheriff of Cutter's Creek, and I am not ready for that to be over." She looked at the candle. She looked at her hands. She looked at him. She said, "I am not a simple person to know. I come with a dead father and a property dispute, and 3 months of running and a considerable quantity of stubbornness that I have been told is problematic." He said, "I'm aware of all of that." She said, "You are a sheriff with a quiet town and a dog and a house that is too large for one person, and I don't know yet what my life is going to look like when this is settled." He said, "Neither do I. That's not unusual." She said, "I'm trying to tell you something honestly." He said, "I know, I'm listening." She said, "I'm trying to tell you that I want the thing you're describing, and I am frightened of wanting it, because the last several months have taught me fairly thoroughly what it costs to want things in a world that does not protect wanting." He reached across the white tablecloth and put his hand over hers, and she did not pull away, and he said, "I am very much in the business of protecting things." She turned her hand over under his and held it, and the candle continued its conversation with the draft from the kitchen door, and neither of them said anything else for a while because nothing else needed saying. The filing was done the following morning at 9 o'clock, in a room with territorial seals and a clerk who handled the documents with professional care and stamped and recorded them in the Territorial Land Registry, with the date of the 14th of August, 1878, and the matter of the Blackwell Flats parcel was officially before the Territorial Board. Anna stood on the steps of the land office afterwards with the receipt in her hand and Joseph beside her, and the sun of Carson City in August making everything look very bright and clear. And she held the paper and thought about her father's handwriting, and she was quiet for a long time. Joseph stood beside her and was quiet too. She said finally, "I want to thank him. I don't know how to do that except to finish it." He said, "Then that's what we'll do." They rode to Winnemucca. It was 3 days northeast of Carson City, and they went directly, not by the long route, because the filing was done and there was nothing more that Farrow and Swick could gain by stopping them. The documents were in the territorial record. The damage to the Carver Company was already accomplished. Blackwell Flats was north of Winnemucca by 8 miles, and they rode out there on the morning of the 3rd day from Carson City. And it was a bright, clear morning in August, with the sage rolling out in every direction, and the mountains blue in the north. And there was the foundation of the burned cabin still visible, the stone chimney standing alone in the middle of the cleared ground like a monument, and the land stretching away from it toward the tree line was everything Anna had described. The particular angle of the light, the way the mountains sat behind it, the quality of the air. She pulled up her horse at the edge of the claim, and she looked at it for a very long time, and Joseph stopped beside her and looked at it with her, and the sage moved in the morning wind and the chimney stood in the light, and she said, very quietly, "Hello." She was talking to the land. She was talking to her father. Joseph looked at the chimney and the foundation and the rolling 40 acres and thought that he understood, finally and completely. What she had meant when she said this was the truest version of herself. He could feel it in the land, the quality of it, the way it sat in the world as though it meant to stay. She dismounted and walked to the chimney and put her hand on the stone and stood there for a while, and he waited for her with the horses because this was hers and she needed to have it without witnesses for a moment. She came back with her eyes bright and her chin steady and she said, "I'm going to rebuild it." He said, "I know," she said. "It won't be quick, and I don't have much money, and the board hasn't decided yet." He said, "The board is going to decide in your favor. The evidence your father left makes that a near certainty." He paused. "And money is a problem that can be solved." She looked at him. "I still do not have a way to pay you." He said, "Anna." She said, "What?" He said, "I'm not doing any of this for payment. I think we established that." She looked at the land and looked at him and said, "What are you doing it for?" He got off his horse and walked to where she was standing and he said, "I'm doing it because in the 14 days since you wrote a false name on a registry in Mabel Hargrove's boarding house, I have become incapable of imagining a reasonable future that does not involve you in it. And I recognize that this is forward of me given that we have only known each other for 2 weeks. But I have also spent 12 years reading the truth behind things, and I know what I am reading." She was looking at him with the expression of someone who is very carefully not allowing their face to do what it wants to do. He said, "I am not asking you to make any decision right now. I am asking you to know that I mean it." She said, "I know you mean it." He said, "Good." She said, "Joseph." He said, "Yes." She stepped forward and kissed him, which was not what either of them had expected her to do in that moment, or at least it was not what she had expected herself to do. And it lasted a moment, and then she stepped back and looked at him with a directness that was entirely her own and said, "I mean it too." He put his hand against her face and looked at her, and the August light was on the mountains behind her and the sage was moving in the wind. And he said, "Good," and kissed her again, properly this time, the way a man does when he means it for a long time, and the chimney stood in the light and the land was everything her father had said it was. They rode back to Winnemucca, and they sent a telegraph to Cutter's Creek to let Rand Mallory know that things were proceeding well, and Rand telegraphed back that the town was fine. The Ramsay brothers were still in Winnemucca, which was, he noted, slightly ironic, and there was nothing that could not wait. They spent 4 days in Winnemucca, while Joseph sent his formal report about the Carver Land Company's fraudulent land activities to the Territorial Prosecutor's office in Carson City, with a full copy of Thomas Blackwell's handwritten account and the forged notary seal document. He had been thorough and meticulous, because that was how he did things, and he had named names clearly and without equivocation, because clarity was a form of justice. He also wrote to Everett James asking whether the property challenge would be strengthened by the criminal referral, and James wrote back 3 days later saying that yes, it would significantly strengthen the civil case, and that the territorial prosecutor had already been asking questions about the Carver Company in relation to 2 other cases, and that Thomas Blackwell's account might be the piece that connected them. Anna read this letter sitting at the table in the hotel room she had rented, with Joseph leaning against the window across the room, and she set it down carefully and said, "He might actually matter. After everything, he might actually be the person who stops them." Joseph said, "He is. That is exactly what that letter means." She put her hands flat on the table and looked at the ceiling and breath for a moment, and then she looked at him and said, "Do you believe in things working out?" He said, "I believe in working toward things working out. That's not quite the same, but it's close enough." She said, "It's better, actually. It leaves room for the human part." He crossed the room and sat down across from her and said, "What do you want to do?" "Not about the land, not about the case, about yourself. What do you want?" She thought about this very seriously and said, "I want to go back to Cutter's Creek with you." He said, "Yes." She said, "And I want to come back here in the spring when the weather is better and start on the cabin. The chimney is still good. The foundation is usable. I talked to a man in town who does building work and he says it is not as bad as it looks. He said, I'll come with you, she said, every time. He said, every time. She looked at him and said, this is very fast. He said, I know, she said, I have been telling myself to be careful. He said, and. She said, and I have decided that being careful is not the same as being right, and that the stubbornness that is love that does not know when to stop applies in both directions. He smiled, the real one, the one that changed the architecture of his face, and she thought that she was going to spend a considerable amount of time looking at that smile, and that this was not a problem but the opposite of a problem. He said, Anna Blackwell. She said, yes. He said, I would like to marry you. I recognize that the appropriate course might be to wait longer and to do this with more ceremony, but I have spent 12 years being appropriate and I am going to say it now. She said, Joseph Easton. He said, yes. She said, yes. He said, yes. She said, yes. That was my answer. He laughed, which was also the real version, lower and fuller than she had heard before, and she filed it away with the smile as something she intended to keep. They rode back to Cutter's Creek in late August, the weather still warm and the desert smelling of late summer, the different colors of it, the dried grass and the sage and the particular quality of the air before it turns toward autumn, and they came into town on a Tuesday afternoon, and Rand Mallory was in the street in front of the office, and he looked up when he saw them coming and his face produced an expression of evident relief. He said, things went well, I take it. Joseph said, things went well. Rand looked at Anna and at Joseph, and at the way they were riding with the comfortable closeness of two people who have spent time together, and he said, good, with a particular inflection that communicated more than the word itself. Mabel Hargrove came out of the boarding house and saw them and her face lit up and she said to Anna, I was worried. And Anna got off her horse and let Mabel take her hands and said, I know, I'm sorry I couldn't explain. Mabel said, are you all right? Anna said, yes. I am very much all right. Mabel looked at Joseph with an expression that was a complete sentence, and he looked back without inflection, and Mabel said, good. Come inside, both of you. I made a pie this morning. The dog was at the gate. Joseph crouched down and let the dog perform its greeting ritual, which involved considerable enthusiasm and a great deal of movement, and Anna crouched down too, and the dog transferred its attentions to her with equal commitment, and she laughed, and Joseph looked at her laughing in the late afternoon light in front of Mabel's gate, and thought that this was the truest version of himself that he had encountered in a very long time. In the weeks that followed, life in Cutter's Creek resumed its quiet pattern, and within that pattern something new was slowly becoming visible. The shape of two people making room for each other in the ordinary business of days. Joseph continued his rounds and his duties and his considerable quantity of careful, steady work, and Anna, who had begun to allow herself to settle, helped Mabel with sewing repairs and worked at the general store on the days that Clement Pierce needed an extra hand, and gradually her false name faded from the registry and her real one began to inhabit the town. She told Mabel her real name 3 days after returning. Mabel listened to the entire story, sitting at the kitchen table with her hands around her tea, and when Anna finished, Mabel said, Blackwell, Anna Blackwell, that suits you considerably better. Anna said, you're not angry I lied on the registry. Mabel said, I was never fooled. I told Joseph that first night that she had written the wrong name on my registry and he said he knew. We decided to mind our own business. She sipped her tea. It is always my business when someone is in danger and never my business what their name is. Anna stared at her. You knew. Mabel said, darling, I have been running a boarding house for 22 years. I know when someone has a real name and when they have a borrowed one. The only thing that mattered to me was that you were safe. Anna sat with this for a moment and then she said, you and Joseph are a great deal alike. Mabel looked at her over the rim of her cup and said, don't tell him that. He has sufficient confidence already. Anna laughed and Mabel laughed, and outside the kitchen window the late September light was doing its beautiful work on the canyon walls, and things were carefully and thoroughly, beginning to be all right. The territorial board met in September and rendered a preliminary decision in October. Everett James sent a letter that arrived on a Wednesday afternoon when Anna was in Joseph's kitchen making coffee, and he was reading the territorial paper at the table with the dog at his feet. And Rand Mallory brought it over from the telegraph office personally, because he had recognized the Carson City postmark on the envelope. Anna opened it at the kitchen table with Joseph across from her, and she read it once to herself, and then she read it aloud. The Blackwell Flats parcel, 40 acres north of Winnemucca in Humboldt County, Nevada, was hereby restored to the estate of Thomas Blackwell, with Anna Blackwell named as lawful heir and claimant, effective immediately. The fraudulent transfer document was declared void. The Carver Land Company was ordered to cease any claim on the property and was additionally referred for investigation by the territorial prosecutor on multiple counts of fraud. The investigation, James noted, was already substantially advanced due to the evidence provided, and he expected charges to be filed before the end of the year. She read it and set it down on the table. Joseph was looking at her. She said, "Papa." It came out quietly and she pressed her mouth closed for a moment, and then she said, "He did it. His writing did it. He finished it." Joseph got up from his chair and came around the table, and she stood up, and he put his arms around her and she held on. And the dog got up from the floor and pressed its large head against both of them. And the kitchen was warm, and the coffee was ready, and the letter was on the table, and all the threads of the preceding months had pulled themselves into something that finally looked like resolution. They were married in Cutter's Creek in November, on the 21st, 3 days after Anna's 27th birthday, in the small white church at the north end of town. The preacher was the one who drank a little more than he ought to, but he gave solid counsel as advertised, and he performed the ceremony with genuine warmth and only one minor interruption when the dog, whom Rand Mallory had been tasked with keeping outside, let itself in through the partially open door and walked directly to the front of the church and sat down next to Joseph with an air of complete composure. The congregation, which consisted of Mabel Hargrove and the Prestons, who had delayed their journey to Oregon for the occasion, and Rand Mallory and Clement Pierce and most of the town in general, found this entirely appropriate. Anna wore a dress that Mabel had helped her make from the good blue fabric that had been sitting in Clement Pierce's dry goods store for 2 years waiting for someone who knew what to do with it. And her hair was down in a way it had not been in public since March, and she looked like herself, which is the only way anyone should look on the day they are married. Joseph stood at the front of the church and watched her walk down the aisle and felt the full weight of good fortune, the specific and overwhelming kind that arrives after a considerable amount of work and is all the more vivid for it. He said his vows in the direct, unhurried way he said everything, and she said hers in the same voice she had used on the overlook in Cutter's Creek when she said she was not going to run again, steady and decided and entirely hers. And when the preacher said the words that made it official and they looked at each other in the November light of the small white church, there was nothing between them but the complete truth of where they were. Mabel cried. Rand Mallory looked at the ceiling and blinked more than necessary. The dog remained composed throughout. That winter they lived in Joseph's house on the eastern edge of town, and she brought things to it that it had been lacking without his quite knowing what they were. The small domestic presences of another person's taste and habit, a particular arrangement of the kitchen, a curtain in the front room that changed the quality of the afternoon light, the sound of her moving through the rooms in the morning while he was still drinking his first coffee, and the house lost its quality of being too large for one person. He told her one evening in January that he had not realized how quiet the house was until it wasn't. She said, "It was very loud in the boarding house." 4 guests and Mabel and the creaking of the floors and the stage arriving twice a week. "I used to listen to all of it and wish for quiet," he said, "and now," she said. Now I think the quiet was never what I wanted. I wanted safety, and quiet seemed like the same thing when everything felt dangerous. He said, "Are you safe now?" She said, "Yes." And then she said, "More than safe. That is a different word and I haven't found it yet." He said, "Let me know when you do." She said, "You'll be the first." In February, she went to Winnemucca to look at the land with the building man, a reliable person named Cordero who had come to Nevada from New Mexico and had an excellent practical understanding of stone and timber. Joseph rode with her, and they spent 4 days on the parcel, planning what the new cabin would look like, which was not a cabin exactly but a proper house, 2 rooms and a kitchen and a porch looking north toward the mountains, built on the original foundation with the old chimney incorporated into the design because it was good stone and because some things should be kept. Cordero said the work could start in April when the ground was fully soft, and that with 3 men and good weather it would be done by July. She said that was acceptable. Joseph paid the deposit on the construction from his own savings, and when she looked at him about it, he said, "It's ours, Anna." She had to look away for a moment after he said that. She said, "You understand that land is not something I give up easily." He said, "I know. Neither do I," she said. "Good. I want to be clear that the Blackwell Flats parcel is in my name and will remain in my name." He said, "Of course it will," she said. "I'm not being disagreeable. I just need you to understand." He said, "Anna, it is your father's land. It is yours. I do not want it in any other name. I want it kept exactly as it is." She looked at him for a long moment and then she said, "You are not a difficult man to love." He said, "I have been told otherwise." She said, "The woman in Kansas was wrong." The charges against the Carver Land Company were filed in March of 1879. 3 men were indicted, including the regional manager whose name Thomas Blackwell had written in his account, and the notary from Elko who had been selling his seal. The company's land operations in Nevada were suspended pending investigation. 2 of the 3 indicted men were convicted before the year was out. It was not a complete reckoning. The company had money and lawyers, and some of the damage they had done was not fully repairable. But it was justice of the specific and real kind, the kind that matters, the kind that leaves a record. Everett James wrote to tell Anna that the judge had specifically cited Thomas Blackwell's written account in his decision, calling it exemplary documentation of a deliberate pattern of fraud. She read that sentence 3 times. She read it to Joseph. He said he was a brave man and a precise one, she said. He was a schoolteacher who believed in writing things down. He said, the best kind. She said, yes, and folded the letter and put it in the cedar box on the shelf where she kept the things that mattered most. And then she went and made dinner with the efficiency and the quiet satisfaction of a woman who has done what she set out to do and has not had to give up who she is in order to do it. The house on Blackwell Flats was finished in June of 1879, 3 weeks ahead of Cordero's estimate, because the spring had been dry and the weather cooperative. It was a good house, stone and timber, with the old chimney at its heart and the porch facing north toward the mountains. And when they rode out from Winnemucca the day it was finished, and she walked through the door for the first time and stood in the main room with the afternoon light coming through the north window, she was quiet for a long time. Joseph stood in the doorway and watched her stand in her father's house, on her father's land, and thought that the truest version of himself was exactly where he was standing. She turned around and looked at him in the doorway and said, "We should spend summers here." He said, "We should." She said, "And the rest of the time in Cutter's Creek where your town is." He said, "That seems right," she said. "We will have to get the dog used to the traveling." He said, "The dog will be fine. He is highly adaptable." She came toward him across the new pine floor, and he put his arms around her, and they stood in the doorway of the house her father had imagined and she had reclaimed. And the sage rolled out from the porch in every direction, and the mountains were blue and clear in the north, and the land was exactly what it had always been, patient and real and waiting to be known. In the summer of 1879, Anna found that she was expecting a child. She told Joseph on the porch of the Blackwell Flats house on a morning in July, early enough that the air was still cool, sitting with their coffee the way they had gotten into the habit of doing, and she said it directly, in the manner she had acquired from him or perhaps had always possessed. "I am going to have a baby." He set down his coffee and looked at her, and the expression on his face was the most unguarded she had ever seen it, something that was completely beyond his usual careful composure, open and wide and full of something she could not name because it was too many things at once. He said, "Anna," she said. "Yes." He said, "That is," and then he stopped, because he was not finding the word, the one that was large enough. She said, "I know." He reached over and took her hand and held it, and they sat on the porch of the house in the morning light with the mountains in front of them and the sage all around, and neither of them said anything for a while because the moment was already complete. The baby was born in January of 1880 in the house in Cutter's Creek, in the January cold with the snow on the Red Canyon walls outside. And he was a boy, solid and loud and dark-haired, and they named him Thomas Joseph Easton, Thomas for her father and Joseph for his. Mabel was there, and the doctor, and Rand Mallory paced the parlor downstairs with the dog for 3 hours and emerged looking considerably more distressed than either the mother or the father. Anna held the baby in the afternoon quiet of the bedroom, and Joseph sat on the edge of the bed beside her, and the baby looked at them both with the unfocused and authoritative regard of the very newly born, and Anna said, "Hello, Thomas." Joseph touched the baby's face with one finger, very gently, and then looked at Anna with the expression she had seen on the Blackwell Flats porch in July, the unguarded one, and she leaned her head against his shoulder, and he put his arm around her carefully, around both of them, and said, "Hello." The dog, which had been allowed upstairs on this occasion by general consensus, lay down at the foot of the bed and accepted the situation with its customary composure. Thomas Joseph Easton was, from the beginning, a person with strong opinions and a great deal of energy, and his mother's stubbornness and his father's observational intensity, which in combination made for a formidable small person and a very lively household. He took his first steps at 11 months and said his first clear word at 9, which was, to Rand Mallory's enduring pride, "Dog." 2 years later Anna was expecting again, and this time, in the late summer of 1882, she had a daughter, whom they named Margaret Anna Easton, after Mabel Hargrove, whose given name was Margaret and who had been as present in their life as any family they had, and after Anna herself. Margaret was different from Thomas in every way that two siblings can be different, quieter and more contained and ferociously perceptive, in a way that made Joseph think she was going to give someone a great deal to think about eventually. Mabel held Margaret on the afternoon of her first full day in the world and said, "She has your eyes, Anna," and Anna said, "Yes," and looked at Joseph, and Joseph looked at the baby and then looked at Anna, and the afternoon came through the curtains Mabel had helped hang in the front room, and the house on the eastern edge of Cutter's Creek was full of the specific and irreplaceable kind of life that is its own argument against every dark past, every forced choice, every hidden motive and betrayal and forbidden grief that brought two people to the edge of a red rock canyon in Nevada in the summer of 1878 and made them sit down next to each other. The Carver Land Company was fully dissolved by 1881, its assets seized, and its principals either in prison or scattered. The land it had wrongfully taken was not all returned, because the law is imperfect and some injustices outlast the people who caused them, but a significant number of claims were restored, and Thomas Blackwell's documentation was cited in 3 separate legal decisions as the foundation of the territorial fraud statute that was passed in 1882, and that made the methods the company had used a specific criminal offense. Joseph heard about the statute from the county judge in Elko, who wrote to tell him about it, and he told Anna over dinner, and she put down her fork and said, "The schoolteacher who believed in writing things down." And Joseph said, "The schoolteacher who believed in writing things down." She picked up her fork and finished her dinner, and afterward she went to the cedar box on the shelf and opened it, and she took out the letter from Everett James and the copy of the challenge receipt from the Carson City Land Office and her father's handwritten account, and she held them for a while in the evening quiet of the kitchen. Joseph came and stood behind her and put his hands on her shoulders, and she leaned back against him and held the papers and thought about the morning she had gotten off a train in Cutter's Creek, because something in the way the town looked through the window made her feel, irrationally and completely, that it was where she needed to stop. She thought that she had been right. She put the papers back in the cedar box and closed it and turned around and looked at her husband, and outside the window the canyon walls were rose and gold in the setting sun, and inside the house their son was making the sounds of a small person engaged in a private project that would probably require explaining, and somewhere in the front room the dog was audibly comfortable. She said, "Joseph." He said, "Yes." She said, "I am very glad I got off the train." He said, "So am I," she said, "and I am very glad you knew." He said, "I knew from the first night." She said, "I know, I was frightened of it." He said, "I know you were." She said, "I'm not frightened of it now." He said, "Good," and kissed her, and she laughed against his mouth. And the evening came down over Cutter's Creek in its usual way, patient and full of the quality of staying. And the life they had built together in the dust and the desert and the particular stubbornness of love that does not know when to stop was entirely, completely, and magnificently their own. They spent the summers on Blackwell Flats until the children were old enough to have opinions about it, which took approximately 4 years with Thomas and approximately 2 with Margaret. Both children loved the land with the unreflective totality of people who have grown up with it in their bones, who know the names of the mountains and the way the sage smells after rain, and the quality of the light in the early morning when the desert is still cool. Thomas learned to ride on that land and could name everything that grew on it by the time he was 8. Margaret was more interested in the documents in the cedar box, which she had located by the age of 5, and which she regarded with proprietary seriousness. Anna caught her reading them once, sitting on the porch of the Blackwell house with the papers laid out carefully on the boards in front of her, age 6 and absolutely focused. She sat down next to her daughter and said, "What are you reading?" Margaret said, "Grandfather's writing." Anna said, "Yes." Margaret said, "He wrote very carefully." Anna said, "He was a school teacher. He believed that precision was important." Margaret said, "What is precision?" Anna said, "Being exact. Getting the words right so that what you mean is clear." Margaret considered this and then said, "This paper says that a man told another man to make the numbers different so that grandfather's name would not be on the land." Anna said, "Yes, that's right." Margaret said, "That was wrong." Anna said, "Yes, it was." Margaret said, "But we fixed it." Anna said, "Yes, we did." Margaret put the papers back in order with remarkable care and said, "Good," and went inside. Joseph, who had been at the porch railing with his coffee listening to this entire exchange, looked at Anna, and Anna looked at him, and he said, "Margaret, Anna Easton is going to be a lawyer." Anna said, "God help whoever gets in her way." He laughed and she laughed, and the morning light was on the mountains and the sage was moving in the wind, and the land was everything it had ever been, patient and real, and exactly where it was supposed to be. This is what remained at the end of all of it, after the secrets were spoken, and the hidden motives brought to light, and the trap of the false name dissolved into the full and real one. A cedar box on a shelf in a house at the edge of a Nevada canyon town, containing the documents that a schoolteacher had written down because he believed it mattered, and a woman who had carried those documents through 3 months of running and 9 days of desert riding, and one name written in false ink on a boarding house registry. And a man who had read that ink on the first night and known and chosen, without calculation or hesitation, to do what was right. And the land, always the land, 40 acres north of Winnemucca under the Blue Mountains, with the old chimney standing in the morning light and the sage rolling out in every direction, and the quality of the air that made you feel, if you stood still enough to notice, that you were exactly where you were supposed to be. Anna Blackwell stood on the porch of her father's house on a morning in the summer of 1884, with her son in the field below learning the names of the grasses from a book she had given him, and her daughter on the porch boards behind her doing something deliberate with a piece of chalk, and her husband coming up from the barn with his hat pushed back and the dog trotting at his side, and the morning so clear and still and full that it was almost difficult to hold, the way all the best things are. He came up the porch steps and stood beside her, and they looked out at the land together, the way they had been doing in one way or another since the beginning, and she said, "He would have liked this." He said, "Yes, he would have." She said, "He would have liked you." Joseph said, "I hope so." She said, "He would. You are both men who believed in writing things down and getting them right." He looked at her and said, "I like the company." She took his hand and they stood on the porch and watched their son in the field below reading aloud from the book to no one in particular. And behind them, Margaret made a small sound of satisfaction at whatever she was doing with the chalk. And the mountains were clear and blue in the north, and the land spread out from the old stone chimney to the tree line and back again, patient and permanent and wholly, completely, and finally home.